Through public diplomacy, the country used cultural events and news programs to build trust with foreign audiences. The orchestra toured overseas as part of cultural diplomacy that connected nations through music. The minister practiced economic diplomacy by offering trade and investment deals to strengthen relations. The embassy used social media for digital diplomacy and answered questions from people abroad. The mediator used shuttle diplomacy, traveling repeatedly between the two capitals because their leaders would not meet. The powerful state used gunboat diplomacy by sending warships to pressure the smaller country into an agreement. After 30 years in the Foreign Service, the career diplomat had represented his country in 6 nations. A senior diplomat with extensive experience led the difficult peace talks. The foreign diplomat represented another government at the national ceremony. As the nation's chief diplomat, the foreign minister directs its relationships with other countries. The veteran diplomat relied on decades of experience to calm the dispute. The president sent the country's top diplomat to negotiate directly with the neighboring government. The athlete served as a goodwill ambassador, promoting friendship and support for children around the world. The company hired the singer as a brand ambassador to represent and promote its products. The artist became a cultural ambassador who introduced a country's traditions to overseas audiences. The peace ambassador visited schools to encourage dialogue instead of violence. The UN ambassador spoke for her country during a United Nations Security Council meeting. The ambassador at large traveled to many countries rather than serving at a single embassy. The embassy staff helped citizens replace passports they had lost abroad. An embassy official met the host country's government to discuss the detained travelers. The national flag flew above the embassy building where diplomats worked. Guards protected the embassy compound, including its offices, gardens, and residences. Embassy security checked every visitor and inspected all bags at the entrance. The embassy spokesperson gave reporters the diplomatic mission's official response. The consulate general, the country's main consular office in the city, provides visas and citizen services. She visited a foreign consulate to apply for permission to enter that country. A consulate official issued an emergency travel document to the stranded tourist. Consulate staff answered travelers' questions about visas and passports. Passport renewal and emergency assistance are among the consulate services available to citizens abroad. Visa applicants formed a line outside the consulate building before it opened. The government defended national sovereignty by insisting that no foreign power could rule the country. State sovereignty gives each state authority over affairs within its own territory. The border dispute concerned territorial sovereignty, or which country had control over the island. Under popular sovereignty, the government's authority comes from the will of the people. The new policy promoted digital sovereignty by keeping sensitive national data under domestic control. The farmers supported food sovereignty so local communities could control how their food was produced and distributed. The countries formed a military alliance and promised to defend one another if attacked. The two companies created a strategic alliance to share technology and enter new markets together. Several parties formed a political alliance to support the same candidate. Members of the Defense Alliance agreed that an attack on one member would concern them all. A global alliance of governments and charities worked together to fight the disease worldwide. The ruling alliance held enough seats in parliament to keep control of the government. The former enemies signed a peace treaty that formally ended the war. The trade treaty lowered tariffs and made it easier for the two countries to exchange goods. Under the extradition treaty, Each country agreed to return wanted criminals to the other. The bilateral treaty created obligations for the two countries that signed it. More than 100 nations joined the international treaty banning the weapon. The Arms Control Treaty limited how many missiles each country could possess. During the peace negotiation, both sides discussed how to end the fighting. The trade negotiation focused on reducing tariffs on imported goods. In the contract negotiation, the company and supplier discussed prices, deadlines, and legal terms. During her salary negotiation, she asked the employer to increase the offered pay. A trained officer led the hostage negotiation and persuaded the captor to release the prisoners safely. Through collective negotiation, the workers acted as a group when discussing pay with management. A neutral country offered peace mediation to help the warring sides reach an agreement. Conflict mediation brought the two arguing teams together with a neutral person who helped them find a solution. International mediation allowed an outside nation to help settle the dispute between the two governments. The neighbors chose third-party mediation, asking an impartial person to help resolve their disagreement. In divorce mediation, a neutral specialist helped the couple agree on property and child care without a trial. Workplace mediation helped the employee and manager resolve their conflict with a neutral facilitator. The two foreign companies used international arbitration to settle their cross-border business dispute outside court. The supplier dispute went to commercial arbitration, where a private decision-maker reviewed the business contract. Because they chose binding arbitration, both parties had to accept the arbitrator's final decision. In labor arbitration, an independent arbitrator decided the dispute between the union and the employer. The employment contract required mandatory arbitration instead of a lawsuit for workplace disputes. The arbitration clause stated that contract disputes must be decided by an arbitrator rather than a court. The leaders improved bilateral relations by increasing cooperation between their two countries. The two governments signed a bilateral agreement that applied only to their countries. Bilateral trade between the two nations grew as they bought more goods from each other. During bilateral talks, representatives of the two countries discussed border security. Bilateral cooperation allowed the two governments to share information and train together. A bilateral treaty was signed by the two nations to define their shared border. Through multilateral diplomacy, many countries worked together at the United Nations to address the crisis. The multilateral agreement set common environmental rules for all 12 participating nations. Delegates from several countries joined multilateral negotiations on reducing emissions. Multilateral cooperation enabled many governments to share vaccines and medical knowledge. The multilateral treaty became effective after numerous countries approved it. The World Trade Organization is a multilateral institution where many member governments discuss trade rules. At the summit meeting, the heads of government discussed security face-to-face. Rival leaders attended a peace summit to seek an end to the conflict. At the climate summit, world leaders announced plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The World Summit brought leaders from across the globe together to discuss poverty. Presidents and prime ministers gathered at the summit conference for high-level discussions. After a difficult climb, the hikers finally stood on the mountain summit at its highest point. A diplomatic delegation of ambassadors and officials traveled abroad for formal talks. The trade delegation visited overseas businesses to promote exports and investment. The government sent an official delegation to represent the country at the ceremony. A congressional delegation of lawmakers traveled overseas to meet foreign leaders. The delegation leader spoke on behalf of all the visiting representatives. The manager's delegation of authority allowed her assistant to approve routine expenses. The government imposed economic sanctions that restricted the target country's access to money and markets. Trade sanctions stopped companies from exporting certain goods to the country. Financial sanctions froze the officials' bank accounts and blocked their transactions. The targeted sanctions punished specific leaders and companies instead of the entire population. International sanctions were enforced by many countries acting together against the regime. The sanctions regime included a coordinated set of trade bans, asset freezes, and travel restrictions. The two armies signed a ceasefire agreement promising to stop shooting at each other. A temporary ceasefire paused the fighting for 3 days so civilians could leave safely. Aid groups called for an immediate ceasefire so the fighting would stop without delay. The negotiators sought a permanent ceasefire that would end the fighting for good. During ceasefire talks, military representatives discussed when and how to halt combat. Firing rockets after the truce began was reported as a ceasefire violation. Because no party won a majority, 3 parties formed a coalition government and governed together. Several countries created a military coalition and combined their armed forces for the operation. The ruling coalition joined several parties that together controlled parliament. The opposition coalition united parties that wanted to defeat the current government. Coalition forces from 5 allied countries operated under a shared command. A broad coalition of businesses, unions, and charities supported the new law. The judge maintained political neutrality by refusing to support any political party. The country declared military neutrality and refused to join either side in the war. Under armed neutrality, the country stayed out of the war but kept forces ready to defend itself. The company pursued carbon neutrality by reducing emissions and offsetting what remained. Network neutrality requires internet providers to treat online traffic equally instead of favoring certain websites. The policy used gender neutrality by applying the same rules regardless of a person's gender. By granting diplomatic recognition, the government officially accepted the new state and its government. The territory sought international recognition so other countries would officially accept it as an independent state. The phone used facial recognition to identify its owner from her face. Voice recognition allowed the device to identify spoken words and follow verbal commands. The software used pattern recognition to find repeated shapes in thousands of images. The familiar logo gave the company strong brand recognition among shoppers. After treaty ratification by Parliament, the international agreement became legally binding on the country. The President's signature completed the formal ratification that officially approved the agreement. The agreement required parliamentary ratification, so lawmakers had to vote before it could take effect. Constitutional ratification required the states to approve the proposed change to the Constitution. The ratification process moved from legislative debate to a final vote and official approval. In the ratification vote, lawmakers decided whether to give final approval to the treaty. Diplomatic protocol determined the formal order in which ambassadors greeted the president. The security protocol required every visitor to show identification and pass through a scanner. The devices followed the same communication protocol so they could exchange data correctly. An Internet protocol supplies rules that computers follow when sending data across networks. The hospital's treatment protocol gave doctors a standard sequence of steps for caring for the disease. The protocol officer arranged the flags, seating order, and formal greetings for the diplomatic visit. The rival groups signed a peace accord that ended years of armed conflict. Under the Climate Accord, participating countries promised to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The trade accord lowered import taxes and opened markets between the participating economies. The two countries reached a bilateral accord that applied only to their governments. The international accord united many nations behind common rules for protecting the ocean. The landmark accord was considered historic because it resolved a dispute that had lasted for decades. After their meeting, both governments issued a joint communiqué expressing their shared position. The final communiqué summarized the decisions reached at the end of the conference. The ministry released an official communiqué stating the government's formal response. The summit communiqué recorded the commitments announced by the leaders at their high-level meeting. The embassy sent a diplomatic communiqué conveying its government's position through official channels. The organization distributed a press communiqué to inform journalists of its decision. The president appointed a special envoy for the single task of negotiating the prisoners' release. The peace envoy met both warring sides and encouraged them to stop fighting. The presidential envoy carried a personal message from the president to the foreign leader. The UN envoy represented the United Nations in efforts to resolve the civil war. A diplomatic envoy traveled abroad as an official representative of the government. The monarch sent a trusted personal envoy to deliver a private message on his behalf. The activist requested political asylum because returning home could lead to persecution for her political beliefs. The dissident sought diplomatic asylum by taking refuge inside a foreign embassy. The asylum seeker asked another country for protection from danger at home. Her asylum application described why she feared persecution if forced to return home. The new asylum policy set government rules for deciding who could receive protection. The asylum system receives, examines, and decides requests from people seeking protection. The extradition treaty required each country to return certain accused criminals to the other for trial. The government sent an extradition request asking the foreign country to surrender the suspect. At the extradition hearing, the judge considered whether the suspect should be sent to another country. During the extradition proceedings, the court reviewed legal arguments about transferring the accused abroad. The extradition law explains when a person may legally be handed over to another country. The judge issued an extradition order directing authorities to send the fugitive to the requesting country. The military intervention sent foreign troops into the conflict to influence its outcome. Humanitarian intervention was proposed to protect civilians from mass violence and deliver emergency aid. Through diplomatic intervention, foreign officials used talks and pressure to prevent the dispute from becoming a war. Early intervention gave the child extra support as soon as the learning difficulty was discovered. Government intervention limited prices when the market failed to keep essential goods affordable. The counselor provided crisis intervention to stabilize the distressed person during the emergency. Diplomatic détente eased tensions as the rival governments reopened embassies and resumed talks. Political détente reduced hostility and encouraged cooperation between the opposing states. East-West détente brought warmer relations and more dialogue between the opposing Cold War blocs. During superpower détente, the two most powerful rival states reduced tensions and negotiated arms limits. The government adopted a détente policy aimed at relaxing tensions with its longtime rival. The détente period was marked by fewer confrontations and more negotiations between the adversaries. Global geopolitics examines how power and geography shape relationships among countries worldwide. Regional geopolitics influenced how neighboring states competed for influence around the sea. Energy geopolitics shaped alliances because countries depended on foreign oil and gas supplies. Resource geopolitics intensified as governments competed for control of rare minerals. Climate geopolitics affects international power as drought, migration, and clean energy technology reshape relations. Great power geopolitics involves competition among the world's strongest states for territory, influence, and security.